So I'm so pleased to be here this morning. I can't think of a better place than New York City to release this study that we've been working on for the past 18 months. When we started, and it started actually with a question from some community organizers who were unhappy about the school closures they were experiencing in their neighborhoods, who came and said, we'd really like to know more. This idea of community schools really appeals to us. What do we know about it? And we said, well, we think we could probably find out and maybe produce something that could be useful to you and others who want to pursue this path. So to be back here in New York City to talk about this study is just a real treat. I'd like to, Julia, you're somewhere here. Right, there's Julia and Anna, my two co-authors, who will be here and available to talk to all of you during the break after the formal session. Our fourth author is Livia Lamb, and she's in DC right now. She used to be at the Learning Policy Institute, and she took a job, I don't know why she took this job, but she is the legislative director for Senator Patty Murray in Washington. So she is there, and that's what's keeping her busy today. The study that we want to talk about today is a comprehensive analysis of the research on community schools, and that's a picture of the cover of the report, which was released, I think, at midnight last night. So, and what we did is we went through, it's a detailed description of studies, but probably most important, an effort to analyze findings across the body of the research as a whole, and to develop a set of research-based lessons to inform policy and implementation. Now, I know you can't read this, but I want you to know that in addition to the 160-page report, we also produced a compendium that's online. It's a spreadsheet that you can get into that has all 144 studies summarized with its talked about the population that was studied, the methodologies, the main findings. And so as you're poking around on our website, you may want to take a look at that. We also thought it would be a useful tool for people who wanted to cite research as evidence of what they were doing or to learn about particular things, to have this compendium available to them. So that's online, the report's online. A shorter brief that we brought copies of today is online, and sort of a preview policy brief we released in June that kind of gave some of the top line findings while we were working, all online. So you don't need to take notes if you don't want to as I talk. This PowerPoint will be online too. So let me begin by describing International High School in Oakland, California. Virtually all of the students at International High are recent immigrants, and about a quarter of them came as unaccompanied minors. They're all English learners, and nearly all live in poverty. Many have lost family members to violence. Some come to school hungry. Some face risk just getting back and forth to school. Most students like them around the country confront enormous barriers to educational success, both in school as well as out of school. But the students at Oakland's International High School thrive at amazing rates. They have a 5-year graduation rate of 72%, which is very high for this very vulnerable population. This is a California school, so they 51% of them, more than half, take and pass the rigorous A through G requirements, which is the suite of courses that's required for entrance into California state universities. And that's compared, so with 51 of them passing those rigorous courses. And that compares with 24% of English learners statewide and 46% of all Oakland Unified students. And college enrollment rates for these graduates is about 68%, which beats the state average of 52% for English learners. So what do? How do they thrive? Well, their school is a community school. And it takes an integrated focus on academics, health and social services, youth development, and family and community engagement. And it's very intentional about it. It addresses out-of-school barriers for this particular community by providing free legal representation for those families and students facing deportation. It provides English as a second language class, mental health and mentoring service at a school wellness center, medical services at a nearby high school health clinic, and an after-school program and weekend sports activities. But it also addresses the within-school barriers that so many students face. And it does so by supporting a very rigorous academic program, but they support it with after-school tutoring, innovative forms of assessment, and giving students additional time. You know, I said the 5-year graduation rate. I guess much like college students, there's no standard expectation that if you don't do it in 4 years, you haven't really done it. So for example, the students spend they create a year-long portfolio of work that allows them to develop advanced academic skills, and it demonstrates what they've learned in a much more meaningful way than on a single test. So with Oakland in mind, I want to say, as Phoebe said, schools like Oakland International are not new. This is an old idea, at least a century-old idea, where educators and community leaders and especially advocates for immigrants and the poor have long viewed these kinds of schools as a powerful and comprehensive response to poverty and social change. So in the early 1900s, as you probably know, reformers wanted schools to be social centers that would help the increased urban population adjust to the demands of urbanization, industrialization, and to accommodate in a positive way the flow of immigrants. In the 1930s, in the Great Depression, social reconstructionists wanted schools to address the upheaval of the Great Depression. Schools such as Franklin High, here pictured on this book cover, in East Harlem, which was then Little Italy, became a community center that really shaped local ideas and politics, as well as educating children. And at Franklin, for example, students conducted surveys to assist in the neighborhood's campaign for more public housing, not unlike some of the youth-led research projects we see in community schools today. But schools like Oakland International also have their roots in African American efforts to provide high quality, if segregated, education. So for example, between 1943 and 1956 in Pennsylvania, the James Adams Community School served black students, a segregated school, served black students in K through 9 as a school by day and operated as a community center by night, offering free activities and classes for students, families, and community members. And then in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of advocacy groups, especially in the wake of disappointment in the post-Brown struggle, saw community schools as a way to build power and to remedy a downward spiral of urban education in segregated cities. They sought community control to make schools accountable to low-income black parents the way schools are accountable to suburban white parents. And in those historical examples, you see the roots of all that we see today in community schools. So stories of Oakland International, together with the growing economic inequality, residential segregation, and the sort of draconian turnaround measures that we've seen over the last few years, have really triggered a huge resurgence of interest in community schools as a way to make schools places where children learn and thrive, even if they are left in under-resourced and underserved communities. So for example, this is G2 Brown from Chicago, and he's the leader of a Journey for Justice alliance of community organizations that's mounting a campaign called We Choose. And the We Choose campaign is comprised of hundreds of thousands of parents and students in 25 cities across the US. They organize press events, they have social media campaigns, policy forums, meeting with elected officials, direct actions, and other tactics. You can see G2 here at the National Press Club. And they have a platform of the schools they choose. And they are mounting this in opposition to what they see as very harmful and destructive privatization schemes. But a key plank of their platform is ambitiously the creation of 10,000 sustainable community schools. And here's how they describe them. Strong neighborhood schools with a curriculum that is engaging, relevant, and rigorous. Supports for high-quality teaching and not high-stakes testing. Wraparound supports for every child. Student-centered school climates, and the end-to-zero tolerance policies in schools, and transformative parent and community engagement. Not a bad definition. Well, at the same time, we're seeing in the new ESSA law new opportunities and considerable flexibility compared to No Child Left Behind, to create community schools under the auspices of the federal law and using the resources of, let's assume we have some resources left after the budget gets passed. But so there's been a great deal of interest in whether or not you could use Title I funds for community schools, whether community schools could be an approach that could substitute for the top-down turnaround strategies in NCLB for improving the lowest performing 5% of schools in every state. So it's also this huge growing interest in community schools has really fueled a huge fight, which maybe many of you know about, some of you may be involved in, to try to keep funding for these federal grants programs that really help, although some of them are not called community schools, that these are sources of federal dollars that can help support community school projects. And of course, the fight is on around the budget. So it was these were the motivators for us, including Jitu, who was one of the activists who came to us and said, what do we know about this? So we took on really 3 tasks as part of our research. And I want to explain all 3 because I think all 3 are really important. This was simply, what we took on was much more than a sort of a what works analysis, although we did that. But the first thing we wanted to do was to come up with a definition of community schools, knowing that there's not one model that consists of practices and structures that should be replicated everywhere the same. That this is not like a package intervention up for replication. But we also knew that it was more than just putting community schools in the name of your school outside on the marquee, the something community school. So we began with the Coalition of Community Schools' broad definition of community schools as a place-based school improvement strategy where schools, community agencies, and local government partners to provide services, whole child services for both children and families. But as we read, and we read a lot, it became clear that although community schools vary in the programs they offer and in the ways they operate depending on their local context, 4 features, or what we call pillars, appear in most community schools. And those are integrated student supports, expanded learning time and opportunities, family and community engagement, collaborative leadership and practice. Let me describe each a bit in more detail, and this infographic is in the brief. We're very proud of our graphic designer at LPI who came up with this depiction of what a community school looks like in action. So first of all, integrated student supports, what many call wraparound services, are specific organizational structures and practices and processes that link schools to a range of academic, health, dental care, counseling, social services, and to issues beyond schools such as housing, neighborhood safety, and other concerns. In most community schools, a dedicated staff member coordinates support programs to reduce these, what are considered out-of-school barriers to learning. And the driving idea here is beyond simply wanting to be helpful to people who need support and assistance, but that students can't focus on learning unless their non-academic and familial needs are also met. So this is probably the most familiar pillar of community schools. And in fact, some people define community schools as only this, that it's a traditional school wrapped around with these services to help decrease the out-of-school barriers so teachers can focus on teaching and learning. But we found 3 other pillars that are also common across these bodies of schools. And after reading the research, became convinced that it's really the combination of all 4 that really are what's making the difference in the most effective community schools. So the second pillar is expanded time, learning time and opportunities. So these are learning opportunities that take place before and after the typical school day. Some of these schools have longer days, as I know that is true in some of the New York community schools. But so a longer before and after the typical day, during summer intersessions. And these activities augment the learning opportunities offered during the traditional school night. Now, some of it, and there's some really interesting models, is extended instruction that's very closely aligned to what happens in the regular classroom. So it really does augment the school curriculum. But other time is spent in community-based learning, both formal and informal. This is more real-world, out-of-school learning activities led by community partners. And the best of these examples look quite a lot like what the learning scientists now tell us are great conditions for learning. Student-centered, hands-on, the engaging activities, working with more capable others, and mixing things with solving real problems in the real world, and also things like music, art, athletics, and local culture. The third is active community engagement and family engagement, which includes a whole range of things, from supporting good parenting, increased communication, much more communication between home and school, strategies for parents to use to help their children with learning at home, family and community volunteering in schools and classrooms, and parents involved in community organizing, in grassroots groups, working on school and district reform. But the goal here is to bring parents and other adults into the school and into the education environment to develop authentic partnerships for supporting and educating kids. This is not just about families showing up to receive services that they need. They become real, authentic partners. But it also includes learning opportunities for parents and community members, like I mentioned with Oakland International, ESL and citizenship classes, computer literacy, and a whole range of learning activities for adults as well as children. And the fourth one may be the one that is talked about least, but that turns out to be extremely important. And that has to do with collaborative leadership and practice. These are structures and processes at the school wherein parents, students, teachers, principals, and community members with different areas of expertise work together to lead and operate the school. So it's really a shared governance strategy. Site-based leadership teams, teacher learning communities, the coordination committees that coordinate the community, the extra services. But it also includes developing a culture of professional learning and building collective trust among all these partners, and shared responsibility for reaching the agreed upon vision or meeting the outcome goals. So all 4 pillars are important, and when you add them together, you do not get 4 additional things that are added onto a regular school. You get a fundamentally different kind of enterprise. So our second task, so that was our definition. So we have a 4-pillar definition. Our second task was to try to understand the rationale. Why would anybody expect these things, the combination of 4 things, to actually produce better learning environments and to have an impact on student outcomes, as well as simply providing a friendly, supportive, warm, nice place to be, which is a good in itself. But what's the theory here? And what we found was that the 4 pillars help schools in poor neighborhoods develop the characteristics that we find in highly effective schools. The characteristics that researchers for decades and increasingly are pointing to as really the elements, the sort of what's in the water of these places that really accounts for the effectiveness around student learning. And you can see on this chart the correspondence that we made between the 4 pillars of community schools on that side and these, some, certainly not all, but some of the characteristics that you see in high-quality schools. So that essentially the pillars of community schools facilitate practices in poor communities much like those that develop more easily in schools in more advantaged neighborhoods, where family and community resources are drawn upon to supplement what happens at school, and where parents' knowledge and relationships enable them to both support and pressure schools to be high-quality places. So we ended up thinking that community schools, if they work because they're creating outstanding schools, not because they're simply providing these special needs to the disadvantaged communities and families. That there's something in these schools that looks like all great schools. So then our third question was the what works question. Advocates and anecdotal stories, accounts of multiple, argue for multiple positive effects of community schools. That children, especially schools that have pre-K programs, help children be ready to enter school. Students attend more consistently. They participate more actively in learning and in their community. Their families are increasingly involved in children's education. The schools are very actively engaged with families and communities. Students succeed academically. They're healthy physically, socially, emotionally. Schools are safe, supportive, and stable places, and communities that have community schools in them are more desirable places in which to live. Now, unfortunately, even though there's a whole lot of research on a lot about community schools, the research does not address all of those outcomes. So you see most of the studies focusing on the big question of the moment in education, which happens to be, does it improve standardized test scores? When there's a whole range of other things that we really wish and would encourage researchers to look at as the less conventional ways of measuring the success of both students and a whole child and whole family and even community effects. But to do that task, we carefully evaluated 143 studies. Every study we could find that, and we had a list of criteria in there in the paper about having a rigorous methodology explaining what they did so we could really get our hands into the studies. And we got studies from academic journals, but we also took research from program evaluation research. It's work that's often not published. It's meant for helping the clients understand what they're doing, not meant for distribution and becoming part of the research base. But many of them are very well designed. And so what we did, and then we decided that since we defined community schools as we had, that the research base does not only include research on these comprehensive community school programs, but you have to take into account the research on each of those 4 pillars. What do we know about those 4 pillars as elements of schools and classrooms and their impact on students? So then I won't just let you take a look at that. These are the 4 ESSA evidence tiers. We know that in the federal law, in order to qualify as an evidence-based practice that can be used as an intervention to improve low-performing schools, that the law requires that the intervention have at least one really well-designed study showing positive outcomes for students in order to justify. And we're hoping that our research compendium will help people who want to make that justification. And so with these evidence tiers as a guide, we assessed whether the existing research met the ESSA standard and therefore could be used as an intervention under Title I. Well, we were really encouraged by our findings. Although it's attendance, behavior, social functioning, some social functioning, and academic achievement are the variables that show up most in this literature, we found that all 4 of the pillars contribute to these kinds of outcomes. And in some of them, it was very interesting. In the expanded learning time and opportunity studies, for example, the best designed studies had the strongest results. Now, it doesn't mean that anything works in these, and that we also found in each of these areas that implementation really matters. But we also found that in the evaluation research about comprehensive school models, there was good evidence that we see some gains, not only these are in schools where you can't say, well, this is attributed to this particular pillar or this is to that particular pillar, that they're schools that have most or all of the pillars. But we saw not only improvements in a wide range of outcomes, but we saw reduced racial and economic achievement gaps. So the kids who seemed to benefit most from being in these environments were the ones who were struggling most outside of school. I mean, doesn't seem like rocket science. It's rather sort of just figuring out what people who work and live in these places know, that if you do this well, it can have some really profound results on, especially on the most disadvantaged kids. And the cost-benefit studies, we only found 4 of them. And we had one of Hank's former students, Professor Russ Rumberger, take a look at them with us to make sure that they weren't completely crazy. And they use different methodologies, but they find up to $15 return for every dollar invested. So, okay, there we go. So looking across the evidence, we answered our question with a pretty big yes. The research is not clean. There are lots of studies of varying quality. Some of the studies, some of the areas have less research than others, but the answer is a pretty clear yes. Well-designed and well-implemented community schools can be effective in improving outcomes for students, and also it provides us, the research provides a strong warrant for using community schools to meet the needs of kids in high poverty schools. And finally, it affirms that the community schools approach can, in fact, meet the ESSA standard as an evidence-based criteria. So I want to finish with another story, a short one. This one from Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was reported in the New York Times by our colleague David Kerp, who's also an LPI senior fellow. The class assignment he observed was to design an iPad video game. For the player to win, a cow must cross a 2-lane highway, dodging traffic. If she makes it, the sound of clapping is heard. If she's hit by a car, the game says, "Aw." The students doing this assignment were second graders. They were in a school where more than a third of the students are Latino, even in Oklahoma, many English learners, and 70% of them on free and reduced price lunch. From kindergarten through high school, these students in the Union School District get state-of-the-art education in science, technology, engineering, and math. But in 2004, the district revamped its schools into community schools. The schools open early so parents can drop off their kids on their way to work and stay open late and during summers. They offer art, music, science, sports, and tutorings, things that middle-class families routinely provide their children. They operate as neighborhood hubs, providing families with access to health care, in a clinic in the school or nearby the school. They connect parents with job training. They deliver clothing, food, furniture, and bicycles. And they enable teenage moms to graduate by offering daycare for their infants. Not surprising, and as our study would suggest, attendance and test scores at these schools have soared and suspensions have plummeted. Just what the evidence would say happens. So thank you. Yep. Oh, I had a picture of those Tulsa children, but I can't seem to. There they are. There they are. Okay, and let me just end by, that's hard to read. That's email addresses for Anna, Julia, and myself. The websites for links to the report, the PowerPoint, the brief, other material, the compendium, which was a living document, and as we find more studies, we'll put more in it. And you can follow us on Twitter, both at LPI and NEPC. So thank you.